In the sunlit room, just as I closed my suitcase for Paris, a ting sound of a text message from my daughter-in-law rang out. "Mom, don't go anymore. My husband, Todd, wants some privacy." Looking at the discarded business class ticket I had paid for myself, I realized the ultimate betrayal. But that was also when I discovered a horrifying secret about to be revealed. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah. Today, I want to tell you about the moment my world collapsed and how I found the strength to stand back up. If you are listening to this while relaxing in your favorite armchair, please hit like and let me know which state you are listening from. Your support means everything to me right now. For a whole week, I could hardly sleep because of the excitement. I even bought a new pair of Skechers from Amazon so I could walk comfortably through those cobblestone streets in Europe. I felt so proud holding my credit card, swiping a large amount to pay for business class tickets for both Todd and Lindsay. I truly thought this was the way for us to bond again after being apart for so long, and a way for me to stop feeling like a lonely old woman in my own family. I even prepared small gifts for my daughter-in-law, hoping my sincerity would make her open her heart. In my mind, the image of us all having dinner at a fancy French restaurant was so clear and warm. But Lindsay's text message extinguished everything. It said, "Todd thinks you coming along will be a nuisance." Every word felt like a cold stone thrown directly at my face. My chest tightened, and a sudden breathlessness hit me like a fake heart attack. They didn't call. They didn't meet me in person. They just used a text to discard me from a plan that I was the one funding. I looked at the navy blue hard-side suitcase lying open on my bed and felt completely ridiculous and unnecessary. The indifference of my own son, the one I sacrificed my whole youth to raise, was the most painful part. I sank to the floor as a total numbness took over my senses, leaving only the sound of my heart beating wildly in the terrifying silence of the room. I sat quietly in my favorite lazy boy recliner, my eyes tracing the worn edges of an old financial folder I had kept so carefully over the years. Memories began to wash over me like a slow-motion film, reminding me of every single time I carried this family on my back. There were years when I worked 2 jobs, pinching every penny of my future pension just so Todd could attend a prestigious university without the heavy shadow of student debt hanging over him. I remember clearly the moment I withdrew $60,000 from my hard-earned savings to help them with the down payment on their current home. I did it because I could not bear the thought of my son and his new wife living in a cramped, rented apartment. I gave them everything: my time, my chances to travel, and even my own basic needs, all for a bit of staged sweetness whenever they needed another boost. Looking back now at the steady monthly transfers to Lindsay's supplemental card, the truth finally set in. I was not being treated like a mother. I was just an automatic teller machine in a nice dress. The real bitterness set in when I happened to glance at a notification on my tablet, which was still linked to the family's shared email account. A confirmation for an additional booking popped up, and my heart stopped. Lindsay had invited her own parents to come along on this Paris trip, taking the very spots I had prepared and paid for. They were using the money I provided to treat her real family to a luxury vacation, while pushing me aside like a piece of dusty, bothersome furniture. My chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice as I realized that Todd, the only son I had spent my life protecting, was standing by in silent agreement while his mother was humiliated. That heavy sense of guilt Lindsay tried to plant in me, making me feel like I was being too demanding, suddenly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I quietly closed the folder and felt my breathing finally steady for the first time in hours. One single thought echoed through my mind with the weight of a gavel. Enough. On the first Monday morning, after the shock of being cut out of the trip, I woke up without that familiar tightening in my chest. For the first time in years, I was not worrying about someone else's itinerary or wondering if their luggage was packed correctly. The gentle Texas sun filtered through the slats of my blinds, casting soft golden stripes across the wooden kitchen table, where the aroma of hazelnut coffee was already beginning to fill the air. Instead of rushing to check on my son or calling to remind my daughter-in-law of some minor detail, I chose to dedicate every minute of the morning to myself. I sat down at my computer, pulled up Amazon, and finally ordered that Kindle Paperwhite I had been eyeing for over 6 months, but felt too guilty to buy. I picked the one with the built-in backlight and the ability to enlarge the font size, so I would never have to strain my eyes reading my favorite mystery novels late at night. Afterward, I slipped into my most comfortable pair of Skechers and stepped outside to wander through the neighborhood park. Breathing in the crisp air and watching the bright marigolds in full bloom brought a sense of relief that is hard to put into words. I realized then that when you stop carrying the heavy burden of everyone else's emotions, your footsteps suddenly become as light as air. By the afternoon, I found myself drawn to a local bakery, a place filled with the warm, comforting scent of butter and cinnamon. It was there that I ran into an old friend from my college days, someone I had lost touch with because I was always too busy catering to the financial and emotional whims of Todd and Lindsay. We sat by a sun-drenched window, sharing a plate of freshly baked cookies and talking about the simple joys we had both set aside, like knitting and tending to our gardens. The soft jazz playing in the background and the unhurried atmosphere helped my soul begin to settle. There were no backhanded comments about me being a nuisance or a burden. There was only the genuine connection of two women who have lived more than half their lives and understand what truly matters. I began to see that my value was never tied to how many luxury trips or weddings I could fund. As I drove home and saw my house bathed in the warm glow of the sunset, I felt a new kind of hope taking root. This was not an ending at all, but the beautiful beginning of a life where I finally belonged to myself. That afternoon, as I was tending to the fragrant lavender bushes on my Texas balcony, my phone sitting on the stone table suddenly vibrated, and Lindsay's name lit up the screen. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling a slight, familiar flutter of nerves run down my spine as I pressed the answer button. My daughter-in-law's voice came through, unusually sweet and tender, that specific melodic tone she always reserved for the moments when she needed a check signed or a significant favor. She began with the most casual small talk, describing the crisp morning weather in Paris and how much they supposedly missed having me there to share flaky croissants at a sidewalk cafe. I remained silent, my hands still covered in the rich, dark soil from my garden, feeling the sharp and painful contrast between her flowery words now and the cruel, dismissive text message she had sent just nights before. I did not rush to please her with a quick or apologetic response like I usually did. Instead, I chose to simply listen to the slight, jagged catch in her breath over the line, a clear sign that her impatience was already starting to peek through that thin mask of concern. After a few minutes of empty fluff, Lindsay skillfully pivoted to the real reason for her call, using a tone that made it sound as though she were the true victim in this situation. She mentioned that the supplementary credit card, the one I had graciously linked directly to my own retirement account, had been abruptly declined while they were trying to pay for an expensive multi-course dinner in the heart of Paris. She laughed it off softly, calling it a minor technical glitch, and asked me to check with the bank immediately so the rest of their dream trip would not be ruined. I stood there, leaning my back against the sturdy doorframe, feeling the solid, supportive arch of my Skechers beneath my feet as I stared out at the horizon. I did not offer a long explanation, and I certainly did not apologize for the sudden inconvenience. My response was uncharacteristically brief and polite. I simply told her that I was fully aware of every transaction on my account and had made the necessary adjustments to fit my own new personal plans. The silence that followed my words carried a weight I had never dared to create before, and I could almost picture her face changing on the other end as she realized my years of unconditional compliance had finally vanished. Sensing that her sweetness was no longer working, Lindsay shifted her strategy, her voice growing thinner and noticeably sharper. She began to poke at my guilt, mentioning how stressed Todd was and how my sudden change was making everything harder for the whole family. She even hinted that I was becoming far too sensitive and difficult to please in my older age. Those old criticisms, which used to make me worry and second-guess my own heart, now felt like nothing more than a passing breeze. I refused to be pulled back into that exhausting cycle of explaining myself or arguing over my own money. Instead, I firmly but quietly set a boundary, stating that any future support would be based on mutual respect rather than a cold, unstated assumption. A new sense of confidence began to stir inside me as I calmly took the lead and ended the conversation. When I hung up, I did not feel like the fragile mother afraid of being cast aside. I felt like a woman holding the keys to her own life. I turned back to my flowers, feeling an incredible and unexpected sense of peace. I was sitting in my favorite Lazy Boy recliner, my hands gently holding the new Kindle Paperwhite I had recently purchased. I was trying to find some peace within the digital pages of a mystery novel, a quiet moment of escape when that sharp, invasive sound suddenly tore through the silence of the room. It was the dry, abrasive clicking of a key being forced into the lock. The sound was sudden and cold, a violent intrusion into my sanctuary. The front door swung open with a heavy thud, and before I could even find my footing or process what was happening, Lindsay and Todd rushed into the house like a destructive storm. They no longer looked like the happy couple I had imagined enjoying the romantic sights of Paris. Instead, their faces were flushed deep red with a raw, unbridled anger, and they carried the heavy, grimy exhaustion of a long-haul flight. Lindsay didn't say a word at first. She simply threw her expensive designer handbag onto the hardwood floor. The sound of the impact was sharp and echoing, vibrating through the living room that had felt so calm just seconds ago. I felt my heart begin to hammer violently against my ribs, a primal, visceral fear rising in my throat as my privacy was violated in the one place where I was supposed to be safe. They stood there in the middle of my home, their breathing heavy and ragged, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had broken into my own house, creating an atmosphere so suffocating it was hard to draw a full breath. Lindsay was the first to strike, her voice rising in a piercing, high-pitched screech that had none of the fake sweetness from our earlier phone call. She began screaming about how she had been utterly humiliated at a world-class restaurant in the heart of France. She described the moment the supplemental credit card was declined right in front of her own parents, making her look small and incapable. Todd stood just behind her, not saying a single word to defend his own mother. Instead, he looked at me with an accusing, heavy gaze, as if I were the one who had committed some terrible, unforgivable crime. They started throwing labels at me, calling me a selfish mother and claiming I was being far too sensitive. They were intentionally choosing words designed to trigger the deep-seated guilt I had carried for decades, the guilt of a mother who always felt she had to do more. Lindsay shouted that my decision to cut off the financial support was nothing more than a cowardly act of revenge. She claimed I was intentionally destroying the dream of a united family that she had worked so hard to build. Every word they spat out felt like a heavy stone being thrown directly at my self-esteem, an attempt to erode the small spark of willpower I had only just started to reclaim. The living room, which was filled with so many years of family memories, had suddenly been transformed into a hostile arena of betrayal. The initial waves of fear slowly began to recede, replaced by a hot, steady current of electricity flowing down my spine. I slowly and deliberately stood up from my chair, keeping my back straight and my eyes fixed forward, no longer willing to look away. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and measured, but it carried the immense weight of decades of silent sacrifice. I began to list the facts they wanted to ignore, starting with the $60,000 I had pulled from my own retirement savings, just so they could have a roof over their heads. I talked about the years I spent working double shifts, exhausting my body and mind so that Todd could graduate from a top-tier university without a single penny of debt. I reminded them, word for word, of that cruel text message that had discarded me from a trip I was paying for, a message that treated me like a nuisance rather than a parent. As I spoke, the air in the room seemed to thicken. My past silence had clearly led them to believe I was weak and submissive, but every detail I provided was now undeniable proof of how they had exploited my love and my finances. I looked directly into Todd's eyes, the son I had nurtured and protected with everything I had, and I made sure he saw the deep, jagged scars his betrayal had left on my heart. When they found themselves backed into a corner by the cold, hard truth of my words and the numbers I laid out, Lindsay's mask of social grace completely shattered, revealing a raw and naked greed. She didn't show even a flicker of remorse for using my hard-earned money to fly her own parents across the ocean. Instead, she had the audacity to claim that her parents were the real family because they actually knew how to appreciate them. The confrontation reached a boiling point when Lindsay began to scream that this house and all my assets were going to be theirs, eventually through inheritance anyway. She argued that my attempt to control my own finances now was completely irrational and unfair to them. That dangerous delusion of entitlement to a senior's property was evident in every bitter word she threw at me. Todd just stood there, nodding along in silent agreement with his wife, showing me that he was a full accomplice in this plan to turn me into a voiceless, faceless bank account. I stood there in shock, realizing that in their eyes, I was no longer a mother or a person with feelings. To them, I was simply an obstacle standing in the way of what they believed they already owned. They didn't stop at attacking my finances. They moved on to their most poisonous strategy yet, threatening my very freedom. Lindsay curled her lip into a cruel smirk and began speaking in a chillingly detached voice about how I was clearly showing signs of being mentally unstable. She suggested, with a terrifying coldness, that I needed to be placed in a professional nursing home where I could receive the care someone in my condition required. This was a direct, calculated threat aimed at stripping away my autonomy and my sense of safety. It was a desperate attempt to seize control of this house much sooner than they were entitled to. They were intentionally digging into the deepest fears of any aging person, the fear of being isolated, forgotten, and discarded, just to force me into reopening the credit lines I had closed. Looking at the twisted, hateful face of my daughter-in-law and the cold, empty silence of my son, I saw a canyon between us that could never be bridged. I realized then that I wasn't just having a family argument. I was in a fight to protect my dignity, my home, and my very life. The anger inside me finally erupted. But it wasn't the kind of anger that involved screaming or losing control. It was a quiet, decisive explosion that moved my feet toward the front door. I gripped the handle, pulled the door wide open, and told them in no uncertain terms that they had to leave my house immediately. I stated clearly that this home was still in my name. It was my property, and I would not allow anyone to stand under my roof and disrespect me for another second. Lindsay looked stunned by the sudden iron in my voice. She tried to step toward me to continue her verbal assault, but I stood my ground with a level of resolve I had never known I possessed. The sheer confidence in my posture made them realize that the mother who used to bend over backward to keep the peace no longer existed. Todd looked uncomfortable, finally reaching out to pull his wife back, but Lindsay didn't leave without throwing one last venomous threat over her shoulder. She told me I would live to regret this, and that they weren't going to let this go. When the door finally slammed shut behind them, the sound of the latch clicking into place felt like a definitive period at the end of a long, painful sentence of endurance. When the room was finally empty and silent once more, the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright suddenly drained away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. My knees began to shake so violently that I had to lean my weight against the wall just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. My breath was coming in short, ragged gasps, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. But beneath the physical toll, there was an intense, overwhelming sense of liberation spreading through my chest. I looked around the quiet room, and the family photographs sitting on the shelves suddenly looked different to me. They were no longer heavy chains of obligation. They were just fragments of a past that no longer had the power to dictate my future. I realized that I had just taken a step from which there was no turning back, a powerful declaration that I was still the master of my own life. The silence of the house was no longer something to be feared. It felt like the peaceful, clean air that follows a devastating hurricane. I walked over to the window and watched their car disappear down the street. And for the first time in years, I felt as if a massive, crushing weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I didn't sleep at all that night, but it wasn't because I was drowning in sadness. My mind was too busy, too focused on drafting the plans for what had to come next. I knew deep down that this was only the opening act of a difficult struggle, and they wouldn't walk away from the assets they believed were rightfully theirs without a fight. I went around the house and double-checked every single lock, feeling the fragility of my safety, but knowing it was necessary. I picked up my Kindle again, not to read the story on the screen, but to use the moment to remind myself that I had to be stronger than ever to protect the life I had worked so hard to build. I knew I would need real allies now, the kind found in a courtroom and the kind found in true friendship. The warm amber light of my living room lamp felt like a comforting embrace, giving me a small boost of strength. I knew that when the sun came up, it would be a brand new day, the day I would start building a defense so strong that no one would ever be able to hurt me like that again. Tuesday morning arrived with a crispness that matched my internal resolve. I found myself driving to the local Home Depot with a shopping list unlike any I had ever written in my 60-some years of life. Usually, I would be wandering through the garden center looking for a new shade of petunias or perhaps some organic fertilizer for my vegetable patch. But today, I walked with a different purpose. My Skechers hitting the concrete floor with a steady, rhythmic thud as I bypassed the flowers and headed straight for the heavy-duty security section. I sought out the highest-rated deadbolt locks they had, the kind that felt substantial and unyielding in my hand. I also picked up a reinforced security latch for the back door, the type that could withstand a significant amount of force. There was something strangely comforting about the weight of those metal blocks in my palm. They were physical manifestations of the boundaries I was finally drawing around my life. By that very afternoon, I stood in my hallway and watched a professional locksmith work. I supervised him as he replaced every single lock in the house, from the front entryway to the garage door, and even the small access point to the cellar. The old keys, the ones that Todd and Lindsay used to let themselves in whenever they felt entitled to my space or my time, were now nothing more than useless scraps of metal. As I watched the locksmith tighten the final screws, I felt a heavy, invisible wall rising around me, one that was finally impenetrable. Each sharp, clean click of the new locks as I tested them was a quiet but firm declaration that my privacy was no longer up for negotiation. My next destination was the bank, the same branch where I had kept my accounts for over 30 years. I walked in and asked to speak with a manager, someone I had known by name for a long time. I requested the immediate closure of every account that was linked to the supplementary cards held by Todd and Lindsay. I then opened a completely new account, one that existed solely in my name, and I insisted on setting up a rigorous two-factor authentication system that would be tied only to my new personal phone. The bank employee looked at me with a bit of surprise when I asked to revoke every financial power of attorney and authorization I had signed in the past, but I simply met their gaze with a steady, unwavering nod. I knew deep in my soul that allowing them to keep their grip on my financial lifeline was a slow form of self-destruction that I could no longer permit. I made sure that every utility bill, the electricity, the water, and the internet, was rerouted to a private, secure email address that I had just created. Stepping back out into the bright Texas sun with that new bank card tucked safely in my wallet, I felt the reins of my own life returning to my hands, one firm pull at a time. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I kept a very important appointment at a law office known for its work in protecting the rights of seniors. The office was quiet and smelled of old paper and expensive leather, a dignified space that made me feel taken seriously. I sat down and calmly laid out the entire story, from the years of financial support to the explosive confrontation that had just occurred in my living room. The attorney listened with a focused intensity, occasionally pausing to jot down notes about the house I owned and the specific amounts I had contributed over the years. We began the process of completely overhauling my will and every legal document associated with my assets. I specifically asked for a formal document to be drafted that clearly stated my sole ownership of the property where my children were currently living as guests. Hiring a professional was about more than just legal paperwork. It was about creating a solid foundation where I could stand tall against the psychological storms my children were sure to send my way. I left that office as the evening shadows lengthened, feeling lighter than I had in years, because I knew I finally had a professional ally standing in my corner. Later that evening, I pulled up Amazon on my computer and ordered a complete Ring security camera system to cover all 4 corners of my home. Setting up the application on my new phone allowed me to see every movement outside my door, no matter where I happened to be. I spent a good portion of the night adjusting the camera angles on the screen, making sure there were absolutely no blind spots around the entryway or the windows. Seeing the sharp, clear images of my own front porch transmitted directly to my tablet gave me a sense of control I didn't realize I had been missing for so long. These digital eyes were now my sentinels, standing guard and recording every piece of evidence should anyone try to intrude on my peace again. That vague, lingering fear of a surprise attack began to evaporate, replaced by a strategic plan of action that made me feel secure. My home was no longer a place where I felt vulnerable. It had truly become a fortress designed to protect the woman who lived inside its walls. The final part of my defense was perhaps the most emotional, a total digital separation. I sat down and systematically changed the passwords to every single one of my social media accounts, my emails, and my online shopping profiles that I suspected Lindsay might have access to. I took the step of blocking both of their phone numbers, not out of a sense of petty hatred, but out of a desperate need to keep my mind from being poisoned by any more insults or manipulation. I also quietly removed myself from the various family group chats on Facebook, the places where Lindsay often loved to parade her lifestyle, which was so often funded by my hard work. This silence was a necessary boundary for them, but for me, it was a profound form of healing. I realized I no longer had any desire to know what they were eating in Paris or what they were saying about me to their friends. Cutting those digital ties felt like closing the very last door and stepping into a new world that was defined only by my own peace and self-respect. That night, I brewed myself a cup of hot herbal tea and sat quietly in my living room, the house securely locked and dark except for the warm glow of my reading lamp. The silence of the house was profound, but it wasn't the lonely silence of someone who had been abandoned. It was the satisfied quiet of a woman who had won a major battle against her own fear. I opened my Kindle and began to read, no longer jumping at every small sound from the street outside. My camera system was active. My new locks were gleaming in the porch light, and my assets were now sealed under a layer of legal protection. I could feel a new kind of inner strength growing within me, a sense of safety that started in my mind and reached down to the tips of my fingers. I was no longer a passive victim waiting for the scraps of affection from ungrateful children. I was Sarah Owens, and I had finally reclaimed my own kingdom. The next morning, as I was out on the porch tentatively checking on my potted plants in the soft Texas light, Mrs. Gable, my neighbor from across the street, surprised me by walking up the driveway with 2 Starbucks coffees in her hands. After that loud, ugly shouting match with Todd and Lindsay the day before, I had planned to pull the curtains and hide away in shame. But the gentle, knowing look in her eyes melted every wall I had tried to build up. We sat down together on the wooden chairs on my front porch, where a soft breeze was rustling through the leaves of the old oak trees. Mrs. Gable reached over and gently took my hand, telling me she had overheard the hurtful things those children had screamed at me, and she told me she understood exactly how it felt to have your lifelong sacrifices treated like they were nothing. I finally opened my heart to her, telling her about the shattered Paris dream and the deep, hollow ache of being cast aside by my own flesh and blood. The empathy of another woman who had also walked through the autumn of her life was like a soothing balm on an open wound. I realized then that I had been living far too quietly, isolating myself in my family pain, while genuine help and a kind heart were right across the street all along. Being heard and truly understood brought a warmth back into my chest that I thought had turned to ice after that betrayal. Not long after my talk with Mrs. Gable, the phone rang, and it was Evelyn, my dear friend from back when we both worked at the city post office. Evelyn wasn't just calling to check in. She brought a mountain of strength with her over the line. She reminded me of all those hard, leaning years I spent toiling away just to make sure Todd had every opportunity. And she told me flat out that she was ready to stand as a witness if any legal trouble or nasty disputes came my way. Her firm, unwavering voice gave me a whole new kind of energy. We made plans for tea at my house to go over everything and start dreaming up some trips of our own. The kind of trips where we wouldn't have to answer to anyone or pay for people who didn't love us back. Having these allies appear out of the shadows suddenly erased that lingering feeling of being small and powerless. I wasn't just a lonely widow suffering in silence anymore. With Evelyn and Mrs. Gable standing by my side, I felt wrapped in a support system so solid that I was finally ready for whatever underhanded thing Lindsay and Todd decided to try next. Later that afternoon, I went with Mrs. Gable to a local pet shop because I knew I needed more than just human friends. I needed a reason to smile every morning. When I saw a small golden retriever puppy with deep ink-black eyes, I knew I had found a new kind of comfort. The presence of real friends and a tiny soul that actually needed my care helped me redefine what family really meant. Family doesn't have to be the people who share your blood, but treat you like a burden. It is the people who stand in the gap when you are falling apart. I felt stronger than I ever had before, not because of bitterness, but because of the love and respect I finally knew I deserved. That afternoon, I was cleaning out my old home office, a small room at the back of the house that had mostly become a storage space for old memories and paperwork. I was preparing for a complete inventory of my assets as my lawyer had suggested, moving boxes of old tax returns and bank statements when I happened to find an old tablet tucked deep into the back of a desk drawer. It was a device that Lindsay had used for nearly a year before she convinced me to buy her the newest model on my account. As I plugged it into the wall to charge and watched the screen flicker to life, I realized her personal email account was still automatically logged in. A strange sense of curiosity mixed with a heavy dread urged me to look through the saved folders. The air in that small, dusty office seemed to grow thick and heavy as my eyes landed on subject lines that were chillingly calculated. It felt like I was stepping into a mystery where the victim was myself, stumbling upon secrets that were never meant for my eyes. The words scrolling across the screen were no longer the polite, casual greetings she used in person. They were a series of meticulous plans regarding the management and eventual transfer of my lifelong savings into their own names. My heart hammered against my ribs and my hands began to shake as I opened attachments filled with spreadsheets, account numbers, and diagrams showing the partition of everything I owned. The more I read, the more a deep sense of disgust rose in my throat, realizing that this plan had been quietly growing for more than 2 years. The email threads between Lindsay and Todd showed they had been secretly consulting with a financial advisor about the most efficient legal ways to seize ownership of the house that currently stands only in my name. They discussed, with terrifying detachment, how they would document what they called my signs of memory loss, a decline they planned to carefully stage, to justify stripping me of my financial autonomy. The most painful part was seeing Todd's responses. My only son, whom I had protected and nurtured with everything I had, was agreeing with his wife that I was holding onto too many unnecessary assets and that it was better for them to take over before I ruined everything. The truth was laid bare before me. That entire Paris trip was never meant to be a family vacation. It was a calculated step to make me feel like a burden, a way to wear me down until I felt incapable and would easily sign over the permanent power of attorney they so desperately wanted. Every illusion I had left about family love and loyalty shattered in that moment, leaving behind a clarity that was as cold as ice. Instead of falling apart under the weight of this horrifying discovery, I felt a wave of icy strength flow through me. I sat there in the silence, calmly using my own phone to take clear photographs of every conversation, every email, and every document that proved this long-term plot. Every photo I snapped was a piece of undeniable evidence, a protective shield I would use to defend my life and my dignity. I immediately forwarded all of this data to my attorney, Marcus Chen, through a secure, encrypted line we had established. The disgust I felt was slowly transforming into a profound realization. I finally understood that my years of generosity had simply been the fertile ground where their greed was allowed to grow. As I finally turned off the tablet screen, I looked out the office window and watched the sunset fading over the trees. I knew the journey ahead would be difficult and that they would not let go easily. But with this evidence in my hands, I was no longer the passive mother waiting to be told my own fate. I was finally holding the keys to my own freedom. Late in the afternoon, as the deep golden sunbeams began to stretch across the wide Texas fields, I found myself driving toward the quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city. This is the place where Samuel, my late husband, has been resting beneath the branches of an old oak tree that whispers in the wind. I brought with me a bouquet of white lilies, the very flowers he used to give me for every single wedding anniversary. The air here felt completely separate from the noise, the clutter, and the terrible schemes I had been forced to face within the walls of my own home. My footsteps slowed as I walked across the lush green grass, feeling the creeping chill of the sunset soaking into my skin through my light jacket. Standing before the gray granite headstone, I gently placed the flowers down and traced the carved letters of his name with my fingers. In the absolute stillness of that place, I felt my soul being washed clean of the resentment and exhaustion that had piled up over the last few weeks. The sadness of his passing was still there, but it wasn't sharp anymore. Instead, it felt like a soft, comforting embrace for a woman who was reaching her breaking point because of her children's betrayal. I sat down on the stone bench beside his grave and closed my eyes, listening for the deep, warm echoes of Samuel's voice in my mind. I remembered the years we spent building our life together from nothing, and the many nights he stayed up late, working extra shifts just so we could afford the house I live in today. Samuel always taught me that the honor and self-esteem of a Black woman were her most precious possessions, things that no one had the right to take away or trample upon. I whispered to him about how much Todd had changed, telling him how the son we had protected with everything we had was now working with an outsider to drain the very lifeblood from his mother. A sudden warmth spread through me, as if an invisible hand had been placed on my shoulder to give strength to my fractured heart. I realized then that Samuel would never want to see me submit or crumble under these dirty tactics. The memory of his unconditional love was the reminder I needed to know that I am still worthy of being cherished and protected. When I stood up to leave, I no longer felt the weakness or the crushing loneliness that had been following me like a shadow. A thin silver moon was beginning to show in the sky, lighting the small path back to the parking lot. I looked back at my husband's grave one last time with a gentle smile and a heart full of gratitude. This spiritual meeting helped me understand that I am not just fighting for myself. I am fighting to protect the legacy and the values that Samuel spent his entire life building. My determination had become as hard as that granite stone, ready to face whatever attack Lindsay and Todd decided to throw at me next. I drove back home with a completely different mindset, a terrifying kind of calm before the legal battle ahead. My tears of resentment had finally dried, replaced by the sharp, clear gaze of a woman who has found her roots and her own power again. That morning, I was sitting in my small home library, trying to lose myself in the glowing screen of my Kindle Paperwhite. I had adjusted the font to be large and clear, and the soft backlight was gentle on my eyes as I tried to find some peace away from the chaos of the last few days. But the stillness was suddenly shattered by the persistent jarring ring of my doorbell. I didn't even have to get up. I simply glanced at my tablet, where the Ring camera feed showed 3 people standing on my front porch. 2 men in professional uniforms and a woman holding a thick, imposing folder. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach as I realized they weren't the usual delivery drivers. When I opened the door, the woman introduced them as representatives from Adult Protective Services. They told me they had received an emergency report alleging that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline and was no longer capable of managing my own affairs or physical safety. A wave of violation washed over me, a feeling like ice-cold water being poured down my spine. I knew exactly where this had come from. Lindsay and Todd had found the most heartless way to strike back, trying to use the system to lock me away and take the keys to my life. The social worker led the way into my living room, her eyes scanning my home like she was looking for signs of a mind unraveling. She began asking a series of probing clinical questions, demanding that I recall specific dates and recent financial transactions. She mentioned the report claimed I had been exhibiting erratic behavior, specifically citing the sudden act of cutting off my children's financial support and replacing all the locks on my home without a logical reason. Every question felt like a trap, a calculated attempt to push me into a state of confusion so they could mark it down in their report. They were preying on the deepest fear for someone my age, the fear of Alzheimer's and losing the grip on my own reality. I could feel a hot flare of indignation rising in my throat, a sense of total helplessness as I realized I was being forced to prove my sanity in the very house I had spent decades building. Lindsay had clearly spent time crafting a story of a mother who was losing it, wrapping her greed in a cloak of false concern for my well-being. Instead of letting the anger take over, I took a long, steadying breath and asked them to wait for just a moment. I walked to my filing cabinet, the one where I keep everything organized with the same methodical care I used during my years at the post office. I pulled out the records from my primary care physician, or PCP, who is part of my trusted Medicare network. I showed them the report from my full physical and cognitive screening from just 2 months ago, a report that confirmed my brain health was perfectly stable and my mind was as sharp as ever. I also brought out my neatly organized utility bills and bank statements, showing that every single payment was accounted for and managed with precision. My handwriting was clear, my records were impeccable, and the evidence was undeniable. As the social worker looked over the documents, I saw her expression shift from one of suspicion to genuine surprise. The woman in front of her was nothing like the disoriented senior described in the report. Just as the tension in the room was reaching its peak, my lawyer, Marcus Chen, arrived. I had called him the second I saw the APS uniforms on my camera, and seeing him walk in wearing his sharp gray suit gave me a sudden, powerful sense of safety. Marcus didn't waste a single second. He stepped in and pointed out that this entire investigation was clearly the result of a malicious attempt to manipulate my property rights. He formally requested that the social worker document my full cooperation, while also emphasizing my right to be protected from unfounded harassment. Having a legal expert stand there as my shield made Lindsay's accusations look like the flimsy lies they were. I sat back in my recliner, feeling my resolve harden like iron. This wasn't just a mother being bullied anymore. It was a battle between the truth and a dark, greedy conspiracy. The social worker then dropped a bombshell. Lindsay had already gone so far as to arrange a psychiatric evaluation for me with a Dr. Miller, who happened to be an old friend of hers. They were trying to pressure me into signing a consent form so he could come to my house that very afternoon for an in-depth assessment. I felt a chill run through me as I realized how deep the betrayal went. They wanted a rigged professional opinion to force me into a high-care nursing facility, which would give them immediate power of attorney over my house and my savings. It was a sophisticated trap, designed to use medical terminology to turn my independence into a symptom of a mental disorder. The thought of being trapped behind white walls, losing my dignity and my freedom, made me tremble for a split second. I looked the social worker straight in the eye, and when I spoke, my voice was no longer shaking. It was flat and firm. I told her clearly that I was refusing any evaluation from Dr. Miller due to a blatant conflict of interest. Instead, I demanded an independent evaluation from a board-certified physician appointed by the court or the state health department, someone with no personal ties to my family. I made it clear that while I would follow any fair and legal process, I would never allow myself to be the victim of a predetermined outcome. My refusal was absolute, and the room went silent. I was no longer afraid of their judgment because I knew the truth was on my side. Lindsay had truly underestimated the pride and the mind of the woman who had spent her whole life protecting this family. Faced with my unwavering stance and the clear medical evidence I provided, the APS worker had no choice but to note that there were no signs of self-neglect or cognitive decline. I watched as the investigation began to turn around right there in my living room. They started asking about the motives of the people who had filed such a serious, misleading report. I stood up and walked them to the door, maintaining the dignity of a woman who is the sole master of her home. The feeling of being powerless that I had felt that morning was gone, replaced by a quiet, burning pride. I had pushed back against their most dangerous attack yet, protecting not just my house, but my very identity and my sanity in the eyes of the law. The dirty tactics my children were using were only making my heart more like stone. When the door finally closed, I sat back down and called for my dog, Max, who had been sitting quietly by my side through the whole ordeal. I was exhausted, but I felt a new level of resilience. I knew Lindsay and Todd wouldn't stop here, but I now had a formal government record confirming my mental competence. That report would be my greatest weapon when we finally stood before a judge. I picked up my Kindle again and went back to my book, feeling the peace of my fortress return to me. As the Texas sun began to set, painting the room in a deep golden light, I knew that no matter how hard the darkness tried to get in, the truth would always find a way to shine through. That Tuesday morning was warm, and the air was thick with the scent of the lavender bushes I had been tending to on my front porch. I remember the way the sun felt on my neck as I worked the soil, a simple task that usually brought me peace. But the peace was broken when I noticed a man in a dark, tailored suit walking up my driveway with a folder in his hand. He walked with a kind of cold, professional weight that made my stomach do a slow turn. When he asked for me by name and handed me a thick, heavy envelope, I felt a familiar cold shiver run down my spine that I hadn't felt in years. It was a court summons. Lindsay and Todd had actually done it. They were suing me, the mother who had spent her life providing for them, all because they wanted to take the title to this house. I went back inside and sat down in my lazy boy recliner, my hands trembling slightly as I flipped through the pages. The paper was filled with baseless accusations and dry, clinical legal terms that tried to paint me as someone I didn't recognize. For a few minutes, a wave of deep anxiety washed over me, a feeling that I was being hunted in my own home. But as I kept reading, that fear was quickly replaced by a strange and powerful stillness that started in my chest and moved through my whole body. I wasn't that frightened woman who used to hide from conflict anymore. Every lie written on those pages in black and white only served to strengthen my belief that I was on the right path. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer, Marcus. And my voice was so calm it surprised even me as I told him that the papers had arrived and I was ready. 2 days before we were scheduled to walk into that courtroom, I met with Marcus in his office. The space was quiet and dignified, smelling of old leather and freshly brewed coffee. He told me that Lindsay's lawyer had sent over a last-minute settlement offer, a way to avoid the public eyes of a judge. They proposed that I drop all the evidence I had collected regarding their financial abuse and the unauthorized use of my accounts. In return, they said they would allow me to live in my own house for the rest of my life, but only under their legal guardianship. A small, bitter smile touched my lips when I heard those words. Lindsay still thought she could manipulate me with her fake generosity, believing that if she threatened me with the fear of being alone or the shadow of a nursing home, I would finally break and hand over my life to her. I looked directly at Marcus and shook my head with a firm, absolute certainty. I told him that I didn't need anyone to give me permission to live in a home that I had paid for with decades of hard work and sacrifice. That settlement wasn't an act of kindness. It was a cage disguised as a compromise, a trap designed to legally take the autonomy I had fought so hard to reclaim. I refused every single one of their terms because I knew that true justice doesn't involve making deals with the people who try to break your spirit. On my final night before the court date, Marcus and I sat in my dining room, surrounded by the digital and physical evidence we had spent weeks gathering. We went over everything one last time, looking at the screenshots of the emails where they had plotted behind my back, and the bank statements that showed exactly how Lindsay had been using my retirement savings to fund her own family's lifestyle. The most powerful piece of our defense was the official report from the state social worker, which clearly stated that I was perfectly healthy, sharp, and capable of making my own choices. I looked over at my Kindle resting on the wooden table, the place where I had carefully recorded every single moment of their disrespect and their greed. Every little piece of the truth was now organized and ready to be presented in the light of day. Marcus looked at me and said that we had prepared the best case possible. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of total, unshakable peace. I didn't feel like I was standing in that room alone anymore. I could almost feel Samuel's presence standing right there beside me, his steady hand on my shoulder, reminding me that I was protecting the legacy we had built together from nothing. As the sun finally went down, the house was filled with a silence that felt heavy and full of purpose. I spent the evening carefully preparing my outfit for the morning, choosing a smart navy blue suit and my most comfortable black Skechers. I wanted to look exactly like the independent, dignified woman I was, someone who could not be easily pushed aside. My dog, Max, stayed right at my feet the whole night, his weight a comfort as I sat in the quiet. I didn't have any of the nightmares that used to haunt me, and the old fears that used to keep me awake had completely vanished. Instead, I spent my time in quiet prayer, finding a deep well of strength in my own heart. I looked around at every corner of my home, seeing the memories of my life in the photos on the walls, and I made a silent promise to myself that I would stand my ground until the very end. My readiness didn't come from the legal documents in my bag. It came from the resilience I had discovered during the middle of the storm. I turned off the light and fell into a deep, restful sleep, knowing that when the sun came up, I would be walking toward the justice I had earned. That morning, the county courthouse in Texas was wrapped in an atmosphere that felt both solemn and a little bit cold. I walked into that courtroom wearing my pressed navy blue suit, and my black Skechers made sure my steps were steady and firm on the polished marble floors. On the other side of the room, Lindsay and Todd were already sitting there, looking far too confident and a bit arrogant for the situation we were in. Todd wouldn't even let his eyes meet mine, while Lindsay kept leaning over to whisper to her lawyer, every now and then cutting her eyes at me with a look that was purely defiant. I felt my chest tighten up with a sudden wave of nerves, but then I looked over at Marcus, my lawyer. He was calmly organizing his files, and just seeing his quiet strength helped me find the stillness I needed to keep my head up. The room was so quiet that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the large clock hanging on the wall right above the judge's bench. This wasn't just some regular disagreement over property or money for me. This was the place where I had to stand up for my honor and all those long years of sacrifice against the absolute ingratitude of my own children. The trial began with Lindsay taking the stand to give her testimony. She immediately started playing the part of the devoted daughter-in-law who was suffering because of a mother-in-law who was mentally falling apart. She used this fake, choked-up voice to tell the court about how I had suddenly changed, becoming suspicious and aggressive for no reason at all. Lindsay claimed that when I cut off their financial support, right when the family was going through a hard time, it was a cruel and heartless act meant to hurt them. Todd sat behind her, nodding his head every so often or putting his hand over his face, like he was just overwhelmed with grief over how his mother had changed. They even brought out some unpaid bills, trying to paint a picture that I had pushed them to the very edge of ruin. As I watched them perform that shameless little play, I felt a deep sense of disgust rising in my throat. They didn't mention a single thing about how they had pushed me out of a Paris trip that I was paying for with my own money. They just focused on making me look like an old, bitter dictator. Then it was Marcus's turn to step out into the middle of the courtroom. He moved with a kind of quiet dignity, and he didn't rush to start arguing with Lindsay's lies. Instead, he began by presenting my medical reports from my primary care physician within the Medicare network and the official records from the Adult Protective Services investigation. He handed over document after document that confirmed my brain health was perfect and that I was fully capable of making my own decisions. It completely dismantled their argument that I was losing my mind. Then, Marcus brought out the bank statements. He showed the court exactly how much money Lindsay had been spending at fancy restaurants and high-end fashion boutiques in France, during the very trip they claimed was so stressful and full of worry. The huge gap between their story of being poor and the reality of their lifestyle started to fall apart right there in front of everyone. I saw Lindsay start to lose her cool, her fingers digging into the fabric of her skirt, while Todd just stared down at the floor as the numbers from the transfers on my account were read out loud. The real turning point came when Marcus requested to show the information we had found on that old tablet. The messages and emails between Lindsay and Todd about their plan to stage my memory loss so they could take the house were displayed on a large screen for the whole room to see. The courtroom went absolutely silent as people read those words. The evidence was impossible to deny. It showed a cold and calculated plan to exploit me that had started long before we ever had that first big argument. I watched the judge as he read every single line, his face hardening as he saw the disrespectful things they had said about me. Lindsay tried to stammer out an explanation, saying they were just venting because they were angry. But the timeline and the legal steps they had already started taking told the whole story of their greed. That was the final blow to all their attempts to manipulate the situation. The judge eventually allowed me to stand up and speak for myself. I stood there and looked right at Todd and Lindsay, and my voice was calm, but it carried the weight of decades of hard work. I talked about all those nights I worked overtime just so Todd could go to college and have a good life, and how I had set aside my own dreams so my children could be comfortable. I told the court that this house was much more than just a piece of real estate or a building. It was the legacy that Samuel and I had built with our own sweat and tears from the ground up. I told them I wasn't asking to be paid back for my love, but I was demanding respect and the right to live out the rest of my years in peace. My sincerity and my pride stood out in sharp contrast to the way they had behaved. When I finished speaking, it felt like the emotion in the room just lingered there for a long moment. I could feel Samuel's presence right there beside me, giving me that last bit of strength I needed to finish this journey. The judge finally brought down his gavel with a firm, final sound and delivered his verdict. He completely rejected every single request Lindsay and Todd had made, and he ordered them to move all of their belongings out of my house within the next 30 days. He gave them a very stern warning about the way they had tried to emotionally abuse me and manipulate the legal system. When that gavel hit the wood, I felt a sudden surge of energy go through my whole body, and the heavy burden I had been carrying for so long just evaporated. I felt a huge wave of relief, and the tears that came to my eyes weren't from pain anymore. They were tears of pure joy because justice had finally been served. I watched Todd and Lindsay walk out of that courtroom in total shame, while Marcus and my dear friend Evelyn came over to hug me and celebrate. The battle was over, and I had finally won my life back. 6 months have passed since that final gavel came down, and the weight of the world was lifted off my shoulders. I eventually made the difficult but necessary choice to sell the old house. It was the place Samuel and I built with so much hope and sweat, but the rooms had started to feel too quiet, and the air was stained by the heavy memories of the betrayal I had to endure within those walls. I realized that a building is just brick and mortar, but my peace of mind is something sacred that cannot be tied to a location. I moved into a cozy, sun-filled apartment that sits right on the edge of the city park, and for the first time in years, I feel like I can truly breathe. Now, my mornings don't start with a racing heart or the dread of a manipulative phone call. Instead, they start with the soft, wet nose of Max nudging my hand, telling me it is time for our morning stroll. We walk through the park while the dew is still fresh on the grass, and I find myself smiling at the simple, quiet beauty of the Texas morning. My new home is a sanctuary, filled with the soft sounds of jazz and the warm, golden light that filters through the curtains. I have filled my balcony with vibrant marigolds, their bright petals reaching for the sun just like I am. I spend my days exactly how I want to, getting lost in my favorite novels on the Kindle without anyone calling me a nuisance, and finally booking those cruises I have always wanted. There is a deep, quiet power in knowing that every penny I spend and every minute I live is now entirely under my own control. No one is lurking in the shadows waiting for me to fail, so they can take what I worked my whole life to build. As I sit here by my large window today, looking out at the children playing and the old oak swaying in the breeze, I feel a sense of wholeness that I have not felt in a long, long time. This serenity was not just given to me. I had to fight for it with every ounce of strength I had in my soul. The biggest lesson I have taken away from this storm is that a mother's heart is a deep well of love, but it should never be a well that people are allowed to drain dry without a second thought. Our generosity should never be used as a reason for someone to treat us with coldness or disrespect. We have the absolute right to set firm boundaries, to protect our assets, and to demand the respect we earned through years of hard work and sacrifice. I want every woman listening to my voice to know that it is never too late to reclaim your life and your dignity. Do not let the fear of being alone keep you in a place where you are being exploited or diminished. Your freedom and your self-respect are the most valuable things you will ever own. My life did not end when my children turned their backs on me. It truly began when I stood up for myself. I have finally walked through the darkness and found the light of my own joy. And this time, I am never letting it go. Family love is priceless, but it must be based on mutual respect rather than one-sided exploitation. A mother's blind sacrifice can inadvertently encourage her children's selfishness. Maintaining financial control and mental clarity are the most important shields for older adults to protect their dignity from manipulative schemes. A woman's happiness in her later years should not be confined to serving her children, but should lie in finding peace and pursuing her personal passions. Thank you for sharing this time with me. It means so much to have you here. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with a sister who needs to hear it. We are never alone when we stand together. Stay strong, keep your light shining, and stay blessed until next time.